morning, good afternoon to everybody, I guess depending on where you are. Welcome to our first, I believe, standard speaker series from Reading and BMI. Thrilled to welcome Andrew Roberts, esteemed historian, professor, broadcaster, writer, author. I mean, the list goes on and on. Elevated to the House of Lords. You know, for me, this is an unbelievable treat, and I know it's going to be an unbelievable treat for all of you. Andrew's written some of the most iconic biographies and histories of the last number of decades. Folks we all know, whether it's Napoleon or Churchill, the latest on Lord Northcliffe called The Chief. I think we've got some good props up here right now.
Always display the product.
Always display the product. As a roofing company here at BMI, we know that we know that very well. But written over 20 books, translated to over 28 languages, I believe. And I can't think of a better person for us to spend time with, given the vast number of really kind of extraordinary current events in the world, to have sort of your depth of knowledge and history and perspective around leadership, broadly speaking. We're thrilled to have you. So first, I just want to welcome you.
Well, you are kind, very generous words. Thank you very much. Obviously, having told me that you've also had Seth Meyers and Graydon Carter on this speaker programme, you've put me in my place brilliantly before you even started. I'm nerve-wracked now. I wasn't before. When I sat down, I wasn't in the slightest bit nervous.
I think it's very fair, because Andrew, we'd like you to open with a joke.
I can tell you a great Churchill joke.
Please.
Okay, yeah. So when Churchill was at a reception before the Second World War and bumped into Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, who said to him, in the next war, Mr. Churchill, Italy will be on the side of the Third Reich. And Churchill replied, well, it seems only fair. We had to have them last time.
That is good. That is good. So I'd love to just start, you know, maybe on a personal side. How'd you get kind of interested in this line of work? You know, was this sort of an area of life where you, as a kid, knew this is what you'd always be when you grew up, or how'd you sort of stumble on, you know, kind of the career path that you're on?
Good question. It was something that has always been a great love of mine, history. My father read history at Oxford, so we talked about history a lot when I was a child. I read history at Cambridge myself. But the reason that I had a chance to be a historian was that I was so incredibly bad at investment banking. And actually I discovered after about 2 years of it that I was functionally enumerate.
Yeah.
And this was a bit of a problem in investment banking, as you can imagine, and so I chucked it, only moments, I think, before they chucked me, and decided to try and write history books instead. And the first one I did was about Winston Churchill's Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, and fortunately that was a success, and it led on to more commissions. But it was really because I was sort of rubbish at everything else. Yeah,
well, success is an understatement. We'll get into some of the specifics of the books that you've read, and we were touching about this a little bit earlier off stage, but how do you sort of go about thinking of the subjects you'd like to write about? Is it sort of intuitive again since childhood, or is there a process involved?
Do you know, funnily enough, I don't actually tend to come up with the ideas myself.
Even better.
No, in the list of books, when I think about it, my agent has come up with some, my publisher on one occasion, my ex-wife on one occasion. Luckily, a really good idea that was. My present wife has come up with an idea. I seem to be the absolute worst person to try and work out what I want to spend 3 or 4 years of my life doing.
That's actually very interesting.
It's weird.
Is there tell me a suggestion that you were given that you intuitively thought was a terrible idea and it turned out to be not such a bad...
Well, Churchill. Yeah. Churchill has been... There are 1,009 biographies of Churchill.
Yeah.
So when Stuart Proffitt, my editor, said what we at the publishers, Penguin Random House, said what we really need is a 1010th biography of Winston Churchill. My instinctive feeling was nobody needs that.
Yeah.
But as it turned out, actually, there'd been 20 years or so before the last really good one, as it were. And there were a whole load of papers at Churchill College, Cambridge, some 53 sets of papers that had been deposited since the last big one. Mm-hmm. And there were, including some really important papers, and Her Majesty the Queen, the late Queen, allowed me to be the first Churchill biographer to use her father's diaries. Wow. And Churchill met King George VI every Tuesday of the Second World War. They had lunch together. They talked about all the important things. They trusted each other, or at least Churchill trusted the King, with all of the real sort of secrets of the Second World War. The enigma secrets, which countries were going to be invaded, when and under what circumstances, which ministers and admirals and so on were going to be hired and fired. So, and luckily the King then wrote everything Churchill said down. And so there was a magnificent new body of work, that raw material that I could work on.
Well, that's true. And I'd love to spend time on Churchill in particular in that book, but maybe just starting up front with the broader theme of leadership. It's a little fortuitous. Many folks here are also from Standard, and we happen to be in London at Coworth Park for the Standard Leadership Program, which is something that we've put on for the last number of years, bringing senior executives from across the company and across the world and different businesses together, focused on leadership. I'd sort of start with a broad question of, throughout the kind of course of human history, big debate on sort of the role of the individual as opposed to the current of events. I'd love to just, with all your vast research and sort of writing, how do you think about sort of the role of the individual in the course of history?
Well, the individual's been pretty much written out of the script over the last 40 years or so, especially in the academy. It's assumed that what T.S. Eliot called the vast impersonal forces of history are the things that drive history, and the individual is basically just a sort of cork bobbing along on the surface. But I think that's wrong. I think that certainly when I look at the people that I've written about, Napoleon, Churchill, and so on, there are decisions that are taken by individuals, by leaders, that do affect the course of history in a way that, were they different people, it would have turned out differently. And so there's a role, of course, for luck and chance and contingency in history, which is often underplayed, I think, as well. But the assumption that we are on a road to somewhere, historically, is, I think, it has so often, which you see in the Whig interpretation of history, the Marxist interpretation, of course, has been shown so many times to be wrong. Not least in the 20th century, where history can go down avenues for 70 years that and shunted into sidelines and backwaters and go into reverse massively, as you see in the history of Germany and Russia in the 20th century. So it's not as easy as the determinists make out. If Napoleon had not been Emperor of France in 1812, there was nothing to say that France would have invaded Russia.
Sure.
If Winston Churchill had not been Prime Minister in May 1940, we could very easily have done a deal with Adolf Hitler.
Yeah.
So it does come down to the individual, and also history, of course, is nothing more than the individual decisions taken by billions of people.
Yeah. No, I mean, we tend to be optimists around here. I find that to be a very optimistic answer because the idea of kind of predestiny is slightly depressing.
But also, of course, as well as optimism, it involves huge amounts of responsibility.
Sure.
Because if history is down to individuals, then we have got a moral duty to educate ourselves, to think about things, to work out what's right for ourselves and others. And so actually it involves an awful lot more moral responsibility than the predestination path.
I like that. And I would think, and I could not right, that events often create an opportunity for a leader to arise, but outcomes are obviously very kind of dependent upon that leader that exists.
That's right. I mean, Napoleon wouldn't have become leader of France had it not been for the French Revolution. Churchill would no way would he have ever become prime minister had it not been for the Second World War. So, so in that sense, of course, individuals are thrown up by the collective decision making of events.
So I promise this not to become a lightning round here, but talk a little bit about sort of both commonalities you found, personality traits and upbringing and you name it amongst, kind of great leaders, and also importantly, differences that, there's sort of no one set of checklists that you have to rise to the top.
Yes, I mean, I think it's very important, of course, to preface all of these remarks by pointing out that war leadership is different from business leadership, from civic leadership, from peacetime leadership, and lots of other types of leadership. And all I've written about is war leadership. In my book, Leadership in War, they are particular men and women from 6 different countries in particular moments of their leadership. So you can't make too many overall assumptions and generalizations. However, overall, it struck me that there are a certain number of things together. If you can make somebody feel that what they're doing is more important than just what it seems to be, just making money, making roofs, it actually is helping people. It's in some way altering for the better an environment that society is operating in. That's a great form of leadership. If you can make people, if you can, of course, oratory is a classic example. If you're able to use the power of words to make people do things that they otherwise might not, if you're capable of it's a sort of existential thing, really. It's very difficult to put into words, and the last chapter of my book, of my leadership book, tries to do it. If you can let people realise that what they're doing is more important just than them, and actually has further implications for history, as a sense, then that's invaluable. And there are lots of different ways that it can be done. Napoleon, although of course in the end he winds up on St. Helena and is defeated and is conquered and crushed, actually he exemplifies more of the qualities of leadership than pretty much anybody else that I have written about. And at the end of the first of the chapter on him, there's a list of about 30 things that Napoleon was able to do, which for me sums up leadership.
I mean, a lot more I want to cover here, but because you brought up Napoleon in particular, I mean, I think one of the surprises for me was sort of just his focus on meritocracy and rewarding performance. And, I understand that in, kind of wartime leadership, but in our world, in business leadership, it's something that we talk a lot about. And sort of, even yesterday, the words of no hierarchy on great ideas, I'm not sure if he's known or not known for it. I didn't particularly focus so much on that aspect of his style. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, in the 1,000 years or so before Napoleon, in French society, and not just, of course, Napoleon, but the French Revolution, in French society, you essentially didn't get anywhere in your own life, however brilliant you were, beyond where your father and grandfather were in terms of rank and social status. Under Napoleon, of the 26 marshals of France who he appointed, 14 of them, i.e. the majority, came from suddenly the sons of barrel coopers and personal servants and innkeepers and peasantry and so on. People who had never in 1,000 years been able to get to the levels, the extraordinary levels. All of them were counts, many were dukes and princes, 3 of them became kings. Never before in history did you have this. And it wasn't just true of the marshalate, it was true further down French society as well. and it therefore unleashed the most extraordinary creative energy by the French people that was harnessed by him and went on to conquer Europe.
I know the word great is used a lot, not sort of connotating good or bad, just I don't know if the word is important. But how about the role of sort of storytelling and writing the narrative, use the word propaganda for many of these wartime leaders? How important was that in effectuating outcomes and also the way that we think of them today?
Central, vital. It's interesting, the word great, of course, it doesn't have, in my view at least, a moral connection to good. This is very important, that you can be a great leader and actually be a pretty evil person, frankly. It's like nuclear power or the sea or lots of different things. It can be good and it can be bad, and it can do great things, it can do terrible things. And it's very much how the human, the individual, uses it. So greatness. I mean, in my book on great leaders, I have all sorts of people who you would never want to live in the country run by them, but undoubtedly they were capable of showing great leadership in crises. But to go on to your specific point about propaganda, it is absolutely essential. But what you have to do, of course, as an historian, is to get beyond the propaganda, beneath it, to recognise why the propaganda's there, but also not to fall for it, of course. And so, in a sense, the most difficult thing is actually when there is positive propaganda about something, you mustn't automatically believe it isn't true either, because there's certain things. I mean, the Ministry of Information was putting out a lot of stuff during the Second World War. Actually, quite a lot of it was true, because the best propaganda is the propaganda where 75% of it is true.
Sure.
If you're I don't know, classic example at the moment with President Putin in Ukraine. If you put out propaganda where clearly only about 10% of this is true, then people not only see through that propaganda, but they fail to believe actual news stories that might be positive about the Russians in Ukraine, because they know that the propaganda system is so based on lies in general. So you have to get below the story. Napoleon fought 60 battles. He won 47 of them, drew 7, lost 7. You have a sense that the propaganda that he put out had him killing many more of the enemy, losing far fewer of his own troops, capturing more cannon than he claimed to have. True. But he still did win that battle, you know. And so propaganda has to be seen in the overall terms of what a leader's trying to do. A piece of the puzzle. I guess sort of tacking a little bit, but 3 different words, but trying to relate them. In sort of the kind of course of these leaders throughout history, the role of failure in one's life, resilience in the sort of face of failure, and continued appetite for risk. I'm sort of connecting these 3 things, but I wonder if there's any sort of themes that you've pulled out in terms of some of these great leaders. I find many of the people that we all look up to have probably had more more than a few losses in their life, and it's more about how they've responded to those losses that sort of speak to their future than anything else. Yes. Churchill, when he was writing from the trenches after he'd been forced to resign over the catastrophe of the Dardanelles campaign in 1915, where some 147,000 people were killed or wounded in that, Allied soldiers were killed or wounded in that totally disastrous catastrophe in Gallipoli, wrote to his wife to say, I should have made nothing if I had not made mistakes. That mistakes are pretty much a prerequisite. Now, you don't want to make them all the time, and you don't want to make them on all of the most important decisions you make. Otherwise, clearly, you're a crap leader. But to make some of them, I think it was Disraeli who said that failure is the best teacher. It's so clearly true, especially with the 9 or so leaders that I was writing about. In all of their cases, they made errors, and in all of the cases, they learnt from them. The problem, and you see it a lot in politics today, I think, is people who make the mistake and don't learn from them and wind up making the same mistake later on. That's the problem. Making the mistake is not the problem. Not learning from it is, and you see that time and again in the stories of the great men and women in history.
In particular, as the sort of company has grown over the years, teams and talent and cultivating talent has become a bigger and bigger, theme for us. I'm interested in the role of teams around these leaders throughout history, and in particular, kind of the type of teams that folks would put together. I can imagine a situation where many of these leaders, without naming names, liked, sycophantic sort of yes men, for lack of better terms, as opposed to, a strong team that was willing and able and had the courage to sort of speak the truth, even if it was maybe not what the leader wanted to hear. Was there any kind of connection there?
Yes, yeah, you see it again and again. Churchill writes about it. He actually, if the leader, this is the interesting thing, it's not really the entourage's fault. Right. If this situation pertains, it's the leader's fault.
Right.
Because if the leader isn't intellectually capable and self-confident enough as a leader, not to appoint no men rather than yes men. Right. Not people who say no automatically, but enough people who will say the emperor has no clothes. Right. Somebody who will... who, like Lord Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff during the Second World War, will sit in front of Winston Churchill, breaking pencils in half, saying, "No, I disagree with you, Prime Minister." Crack.
Right.
And as a result, you get from the thesis and antithesis a synthesis of strategy, which turned out to be the best one. Mm-hmm. But you can't do that unless the leader is willing to have people say no. And again and again, I mean, Hitler, classic example of this. He would sit in the Führer conferences, which sometimes would go on for 3 hours, and he would listen to the to generals who knew much more about strategy than him, Guderian, Rommel, Manstein, and so on. And these guys who had fought in the First World War in an officer position, which of course he hadn't done, who understood about strategy and tactics, and he'd listen to them, and then at the end of the 3-hour meeting, he'd go and do exactly what he'd originally said that he was going to do in the at the beginning. He didn't rant and rave as much as one sees in the TV shows. He did listen, but he didn't. It didn't sort of absorb.
Unpersuaded.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He didn't absorb it, and so you have that kind of leadership. Then you have Stalin, who, right at the beginning of the war, wouldn't listen to anybody, but because of the catastrophe of Russian arms at Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, he learnt that actually some of the generals, these great marshals like Zhukov and Rokossovsky, Konev and others, actually knew what they were talking about, and they knew more about strategy than him, and he listened to them, and they wound up with a far better strategy.
That's also encouraging.
It's encouraging that you want to go down the Stalin rather than the Hitler
route. Not that part. Encouraging that we like to surround ourselves with people that have no fear saying no, and we're wrong, and tell us all the reasons why we're bad dancers and things of that sort. There are lots of them here today. The world's moving really quickly, whether it's from a technological perspective and big scary things like AI and cyber, or really fun things like solar roofing and material science. It does feel like the world is moving at a pace that is nonlinear and different than maybe throughout the course of history. Are there obvious or maybe some not so obvious kind of characteristics of a leader that you think will be different looking forward than maybe looking backward?
I think, of course, you're right about the exponential change that we're seeing and will continue to see, and that our children will see it even faster than us.
Yeah.
But when it comes to a lot of human nature, I don't think that has changed, or at least that hasn't changed in the to anything like the same degree. And as far as human wisdom is concerned, I think, if anything, that's tailing off.
Yeah.
And so the essential parts of leadership, such as wisdom, are not keeping up, frankly, with the technological change that we're all seeing. I'm not enough of an expert about AI in general to answer your question. However, in my next
I'm not
book,
sure anyone is.
in my next book, I do have a chapter that I'm writing with General David Petraeus about the future of warfare, and we have to go very much into AI, and he does know a good deal about this, and it is terrifying.
Yeah.
It is terrifying. The things that robot armies, essentially, you know, to use a sort of sci-fi term, but nonetheless a genuine term that is coming.
Yeah.
The things that robot armies can do that human armies can't is going to change the face of warfare during our lifetime.
Yeah, I want to get to that upcoming book and a whole set of topics around modern warfare. But before there, why are there 1,010 biographies on Churchill? What is it about him that makes him so uniquely different than, you know, many of the other great leaders throughout history?
Gosh, that's a good question. And really, having written a 1,000-page book on him, I should have a pat answer, really, by now. But I think it's several things. It's firstly, of course, the times in which he lived, the threat that was posed by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis was such an appalling and existential one to world civilization that one of the key figures who defeated that threat is always going to be interesting. So people are going to read about Winston Churchill in 1,000 years just simply because of that, I believe. In the same way that we're interested in going to exhibitions about Emperor Hadrian and so on.
Yeah.
But then after that, there's the more personal side, the brilliance, the wit, the
humanity.
Exactly. Yes, the sheer humanity of the man. Even people who were not terribly humane themselves, like Marshal Tito, for example, pointed out Churchill's humanity as being an absolutely sort of central part of his personality. There's also, I think, there's a sort of cult around him, a cult of leadership. There's a very big revisionist aspect, of course, because he was racist. He did say things about non-white people that we know to be obscene and absurd. And so there's a debate about him as well. And I think that will interest people. But it's not going to fascinate people for 1,000 years because everything gets put into its historical context. So I think the thing that really will interest people will be what he said and what he did. And that's why 500,000 people have bought that book in 18 languages. You know, it's not just the fact that I'm a brilliant writer.
Yeah. Possible, but before we get to your upcoming book, I just finished The Chief, and you know, I'm not sure Lord Northcliffe is as well known outside of England as maybe he should be, but feels like a lot of his invention was sort of the beginning of modern media, and whether it's the tabloid, broadly speaking, but you know, sort of his answers column in particular, where people were literally, you know, writing in kind of questions that feel like they could have been in, you know, Hello or Us Weekly. It's sort of remarkable.
He virtually invented the paragraph as well, which is an extraordinary thing. I mean, paragraphs existed before, of course they did, but newspapers for the previous 100 years were basically just great big blocks of text, and you didn't have a standalone 3 or 4 sentence unit that grabbed the attention, that each of the sentences were about one thought, or at least one train of thought. Each sentence was a thought in a form of train of thought, and then each train of thought had its own separate paragraph. That was his idea. We all use it. Everybody in this room will have probably used it today.
Sure.
And that actually came from Lord Northcliffe as well. And of course, he founded a company which is still in existence, one of the most powerful news and media organisations in the world today, 120 years later. So there was something there that was really special.
Yeah, no, it was clear, and it was actually sort of shocking to see such kind of modern strains pulled out of the origins of print, newspaper, and media and things.
Yeah,
like
and
that.
the concept of advertising as well.
Yeah.
The importance of it, the way in which you grab the attention of the reader and essentially sell them something that they might not have wanted to have bought.
The debate around political influence of these news organizations.
Well, Lord Northcliffe had no precedent for what he was doing.
Yeah.
So he didn't know when he had gone too far.
Right.
And he was fairly megalomaniacal anyhow. And so neither did the politicians, of course, know the extent to which they really had to sort of kowtow to somebody who, at the outbreak of the First World War, owned 40% of the British media.
It's unbelievable.
He bought the Times, saved the Times actually, founded the Mail, founded the Mirror, bought the Observer. It's just
unbelievable.
And it was just an extraordinary agglomeration of power that would never be considered to be allowed to happen today.
Yeah.
But he had that power.
Yeah. No, that's clear. Turning to your latest or your upcoming book. I'm not one to be quoting Churchill often, but I was taken by the quote of the story of the human race is that of war. And that what you're doing with General Petraeus, sort of tracing, kind of war throughout time, ending here with Russia-Ukraine, without kind of, painting too specific of a question, would love your thoughts on sort of Russia-Ukraine, Putin as a leader, an individual. It did feel, I think to many of us after 9/11, that maybe kind of, the historical architecture of nation-state war was maybe dated, and kind of this kind of modern version of terrorism and non-state actors and that whole version of life was what was here, which is terrifying, was sort of here to stay. But it does feel like we're in the midst of a theater that is traditional in its insanity. Love your sort of thoughts around Putin as an individual, as Russia-Ukraine as a historical artifact.
Yeah, well, you've hit the nail on the head. It's a throwback, isn't it? It's a massive throwback. The book is subtitled The Evolution of Warfare, 1945 to Ukraine. And so obviously, excuse me, the largest war in Europe since 1945 is a key aspect of it. What we're trying to do essentially is to put the Russo-Ukrainian war into its historical context. We don't talk much about the reasons the war broke out any more than we write about the reasons that Iraq and Afghanistan were invaded. Obviously, in both cases, General Petraeus was the commander of the American armies, of the coalition armies in both cases. But we are interested in the evolution of war, of how war has changed from 1945 to the present day. And as you say, many people, including me, I hasten to add, had written off the concept of one army from one country crossing a border and invading another, like Hitler did to Poland in 1939. Surely all that was over. But no, on the 24th of February 2022, Putin proved that it was not over. And so you have this extraordinary, as I say, throwback to an earlier stage. You also have the actual methods of the fighting, an incredible throwback, because for 30 plus years now we've had smart bombs, precision technology that allows weapons to go into particular rooms if necessary, whereas the Russian way of war in Ukraine is the exact same way of war that they adopted against in Syria and against Georgia and elsewhere, of flattening residential buildings and using artillery to attack civilians. And so in that sense, of course, a moral outrage of the worst kind, but also very interestingly, it's a throwback, and you get the fighting in the Donbass as well is a throwback to the Second World War, some of it to the First World War with trenches and barbed wire and so on. So so this, I think, is an illustration of what we talked about earlier about how history is not on a path towards progress. Yes. It's capable of going down routes that were unpredictable, but certainly are not in any way progressive.
Sure, the role of the individual for both good and bad.
Yeah. And of course, as well as denouncing President Putin as I think it's moral imperative of people to do, one has to also appreciate that President Zelenskyy has shown a Churchillian style of leadership, which is, for the optimists amongst us, a wonderful thing to see. Somebody called him Churchill with an iPhone, which I think is superb.
And a good sense of humor.
And a good sense of humor. Well, exactly. And so you know, as well as the horror, there's also the hope.
I want to be sensitive to time because ultimately we want to open it up all to questions, but a few last ones from me. So just finishing the topic here. Modern warfare, the future of warfare, cyber, AI, things of that sort. How much does that change, you know, kind of the requirements of leadership? I know we talk about sort of those innate personality traits, but are there, you know, is it a certain set of skill sets that were once kind of not so relevant that are now much more at the forefront?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Actually, I think that the same qualities are going to be needed. As you say, the speed of warfare is going to increase hugely, exponentially. So you probably can't have leaders like Winston Churchill going to sleep in the afternoon after a good lunch for 45 minutes. He did it in order to try and extend the amount of time he could work. So because he carried on working till 3 o'clock in the morning. But again, I think that that's possibly one area that's going to have to change. But nonetheless, overall, the way in which you use thought and language to get over to a scared, understandably frightened people, the concept that actually victory is possible and that it will require sacrifice, but nonetheless it's worthwhile throwing everything into it. We see that with Zelenskyy. I think we'll see that in future wars too.
New topic, but sort of feels like we're in about as complicated, binary, extreme of a global political environment, you know, that we've been in a long time. Turning to the States, maybe, you know, try and keep this light and professional, but, you know, what do we make of sort of the current U.S., you know, presidential race and, you know, kind of a potential matchup again of Biden and Trump and, you know, kind of the historical context of this very, you know, strange moment?
I hope that the American people might use this, as you say, very strange moment as a moment where you might take another look at your primary system.
Yeah.
You know, a system which throws up the extremes, the way in which it's in the interests of a Republican and a Democrat to talk to his own extremes in order to win the candidacy in a constituency is something that needs to be looked at again. It doesn't need to be like this. For many decades, it wasn't like this. There are, of course, social media has made this 100 times worse as well, but you can't do very much about that. But what you do need is a system whereby it's in the interests of elected representatives to be able to reach across the aisle and come to a arrangement that is in the national interest as opposed simply to the party
Sounds so
interest.
antiquated.
It doesn't it? But nonetheless, it's so antiquated, but so important and so necessary and so worthwhile ultimately if you're going to keep the unity of a very great nation, which America is.
I think you're spot on, which is it's sort of structural in the way that our system is set up right now, and maybe easy to kind of diagnose, but very difficult to roll back.
Well, next to impossible, because your constitution requires 2/3 of the states, and also the individual parties. Everything is set up essentially to keep the status quo.
So maybe closer to home, but no less sensational. Thoughts on sort of the future of the monarchy with King Charles and William and Kate, and I dare say Harry and Meghan. Go wherever you want with that.
The monarchy will hopefully see us all out. It's been around for 1,000 years. It's got a key quality, which of course appeals to Britons. It's not the case since 1776 with you, but nonetheless it has worked very well since time immemorial for us, and that is to have a power that is above politics. Some, in this case, a family, in our case, a family, long historical traditions, where you know that they're not out for themselves. They're not desperate for power. They're not interested in wielding political power. But what they do have is a vestigial power to put politicians in their place and keep them there, essentially. And that is something that we have found in the past to be very useful. I think we might find in the future, especially if politics continues to become populist, very useful as well. And something, therefore, that I think we should hang on to. The individuals, it's a terrible thing to say, really, when we have had in Her late Majesty, Elizabeth II, an immensely impressive individual. I think King Charles is also a very impressive individual. But it's not about the individuals. It's about the concept. It's about the idea. And the idea is an incredibly sound one, to have a power that everybody recognises that is above politics.
So as we start to wrap it up and open it up to Q&A, are there any, kind of leaders or potential leaders on the global field today, not folks we've talked about already, that maybe we don't know about or we're not focused about, that Andrew Roberts 100 years from now will be writing about? Who impresses you?
Well, we have already mentioned Zelenskyy, haven't we? So he can't be there. Do you know, I'm hugely personally impressed by Rishi Sunak. I think it's incredible, considering what he's taken on, and the calmness, the willingness to look at the actual spreadsheets, and to work out the numbers and to put the time in and to put the effort in. And when he goes to Chequers that he gets up at 4:30 in the morning in his dressing gown and opens those red boxes and starts work. That has not been the case necessarily with all our post-war prime ministers. But whether he's going to be known in 100 years' time, completely impossible to say. But I think that we might be in a moment now where it is popular for people to just buckle down and
do the work. This has been fascinating. Last one for me and for fun. What's your favorite counterfactual? What if? In the course of history with folks, if it hadn't gone left, it would have gone right. What's one that would sort of stand out that maybe would shock everybody here and on video?
This is, do you know, David, it is weird that you should have asked me that, because I ask exactly that question of everybody who comes on my podcast. I've got a Hoover Institution's Secrets of Statecraft podcast, and I've had Henry Kissinger and David Petraeus and David Cameron and people on that. And I asked them that question, and I've never thought about it for myself. One, I suppose that one automatically must go to, because of the sheer tragedy of the horrors of communism, of Soviet communism, is if something could have happened in those key days in St. Petersburg in 1917, from the moment that Lenin stepped off the train at the Finland station to the point in which he became essentially dictator of Russia. If there was some way that the forces of liberalism and democracy and essentially, civilization could have been victorious instead of that tiny, tiny minority of people who were Bolsheviks at that period. If somehow Russia could have gone right, so maybe Lenin being assassinated as he steps off the train. There you are. That's one for you.
It's a big one. Let me open it up to the room. I'm not sure how we're going to get started here.
Okay,
but,
I'll kick it off.
There you go,
So we're going to start with questions that were submitted by folks here in the audience, and then anyone joining via Zoom can also submit a question via the Q&A feature, and we can take those time permitting. But let's start with a question over here.
Hi there. The nature of warfare has changed dramatically since the Second World War. What do you think are the most significant challenges facing the world today in terms of security and conflict?
Golly, big question. You're right about the evolution of warfare, of course. And as well as the things that David mentioned earlier, we should be thinking, obviously, also about space, about cyber, about sensors. There are so many ways that warfare can alter. I'd love to be able to tell you I knew what the next stages are. What we try and do is set out in the book what is likely, but as we saw in February 2022, what is unlikely is just as likely to happen. There's a great line of Paul Wolfowitz who said that the only surprising thing is that we're continually surprised by surprise attacks.
Yeah. Please.
Hello. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, Andrew. Good afternoon, David. My name is Sandeep. I'm from the Human Resources Department here at BMI. Thank you so much for this very insightful conversation. You touched upon some of the leadership aspects of some key leaders. In respect of those biographies you have written on Churchill and Napoleon, are there any key leadership lessons that we can draw on top of a couple that you mentioned already, that we can learn today from these historical figures?
There are, yes, and that's essentially the reason I wrote the books, is to try and draw them out. There are just so many. It's just off the top of my head, the sense of timing is important. There are moments when something will work, and other moments where exactly the same thing will not work. And leadership is in part being able to decide which is which and to choose the right moment. As we mentioned, getting the message across, like Napoleon did on the night of before the Battle of the Pyramids, in which he wrote a proclamation that came out the morning of the battle, saying 40 centuries look down upon you. Talking about the pyramids, of course, 40 centuries look down upon you, letting people know that what they're doing matters. There's a whole debate about whether being a nice and sweet and good-natured person necessarily makes you a better or worse leader. I'm afraid my book very much comes down on the point that they don't need to be. But maybe HR departments are going to help in this.
Napoleon did not have an HR department.
No, exactly. No, if you're looking for bullying and harassment, I'm afraid you see an awful lot of it in the kind of historical leaders that I refer to. There's a whole panoply of aspects of leadership. As I say, they're summed up in my Napoleon chapter, which I do, needless to say, recommend to you.
I've got the next question. My name is Kate, so I work for the Internal Commerce team. And I just wondered what the likelihood is that any country supporting Ukraine will actually get pulled into the war and attacked by Russia?
Yes, that's a very good question as well. I think so long as NATO continues the present policy, very correct policy in my view, of huge support for NATO, but no actual physical support in Ukraine itself, and certainly not, of course, in Russia, then Russia won't have an excuse to extend the conflict. NATO countries don't have troops on the ground except a few special forces who don't take part in actual operations. And so so long as that remains the case, and it will remain the case, then Putin, however much his propaganda has been trying to extend the parameters, he simply won't be able to.
Hi, Flora. I'm the user experience designer in BMI. I would like to know, you have written extensively about the First and Second World War. Did you consult any military advisors while you conducted the research for your various books?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I think it's. Thank you. Yes. No, it's very important to talk to soldiers, and if possible, obviously soldiers who fought in the war. I was very fortunate actually to get a chance when I was writing my biography of Lord Halifax, which I mentioned, my first book, which was published in 1992. I spoke to over 100 people who worked, many of them soldiers, worked with Churchill. They're all dead now, sadly, but many of them gave me insights that I wouldn't have got unless I did actually speak to them. Also, I think it's tremendously important for a military historian to go and actually visit the battlefields that he writes about. With Napoleon, of those 60 battles that I mentioned earlier, I visited 53 of his battlefields in 10 countries. And I think you have to do it. It's a bit like a detective writing about trying to solve a crime without going to the scene of the crime. Right. You know, it's very. And also with the topography of battlefields, it's only when you actually go there and stand where the commanders stood that you can actually see what they could have seen. It's a bit different now, obviously, with drones, but with Napoleonic battlefields, that's a prerequisite. But one in particular story I'd like to tell you about meeting Winston Churchill's military secretary, who after a very fascinating lunch at his home. This was, of course, he'd retired 40 years before. But I said to him, so summing up then in this case, this was General Sir Ian Jacob. I said, so Sir Ian, summing up, how on earth did we win the Second World War? And he said, well, I often think about this myself. He said, I think ultimately it's because our German scientists were cleverer than their German scientists.
That's very funny.
I have a question that's come in on the Zoom. Do you think China's and Russia's recent entente is genuine or a marriage of convenience that will end in divorce?
I think that it is in both of their interests at the moment, but it won't necessarily be forever. When I was growing up, Russia and China were at daggers drawn constantly over border disputes in the 1960s and 70s. I can very easily see how those could spark up again. I can see that the struggle for resources is going to be a major one in our children's lifetime. The struggles over water in Africa and Asia, the ways in which vital resources are going to be fought over, inevitably means, it strikes me, that Russia and China are going to fall out with the kind of border that they share, especially if Russia is defeated in Ukraine and if China therefore learns from history and recent history and does not invade Taiwan, which has got to be the most dangerous of all, even more, actually, in my view, more dangerous than what's happening in Ukraine, because what's happening in Ukraine, to go back to your question, does not lead to direct superpower confrontation, whereas Taiwan, it does. And so you have a situation since 1945 where even in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was easily the hottest moment, there was no actual spark that sent the world into conflagration. Over Taiwan, there could be.
David, Lord Roberts, I thank you for the conversation. My name is Ebby, short for Ebenezer, like Scrooge. I'm thinking war is like a business. You're fighting over land and territory and ultimately influence. And the business is fighting over markets and profits and so on. So what parallels can you draw for us, and what can we learn from that, please?
Well, I hope you're wrong, Mr. I don't know. I don't know that. I mean, roofing might be a cutthroat business, but I mean, obviously there's huge competition, but. It's not the case, I think, that you can automatically assume that it's like warfare. The business certainly shouldn't be like warfare. You're trying to do better, but you're not trying to destroy and kill the other side. That is a maybe you are.
We don't like
maybe you are, David.
We don't like to talk about it. Maybe I could jump in for a second, which is, and because you mentioned this up front, which is you've been sort of a studier of wartime leadership.
Yeah.
Are there maybe one or two major distinctions you could kind of pull out from, wartime leadership, political leadership vis-a-vis corporate leadership or business leadership?
Yes, I think so. There's a moment in the Korean War where General MacArthur, the Douglas MacArthur, the charismatic war hero of the Second World War, simply goes too far. And he essentially wants to go nuclear in the Korean War, and he's the CEO who's basically lost his compass, and the president, Harry Truman, in a sense, the chairman of the board, just has to come down and essentially, in the end, fire him. And that's another example, I think, of having this importance. We mentioned the royal family earlier, of having people who are above you, who are able to see to see the bigger picture, be more rational, not necessarily be in the actual day-to-day struggle the entire time, and therefore able to sort of spot when something's gone badly wrong. So there you are. There's an example. Not necessarily the sacking of CEOs isn't necessarily an example you're going to like terribly much, but nonetheless, you see what I mean.
That's okay.
I think we have time for maybe two more questions, and we have one right here.
Yes.
Hi. If there was one figure whose opinions or actions were the most pivotal in shaping history, shaping the world as it is today, who would that be?
A living figure or a historical figure?
A historical figure, sorry.
Historical figure. Very good question. I'm afraid, and this is again, it's a sort of sad statement about human nature, really. One would love it to be, I'd love to be able to say that it was Mahatma Gandhi or Jesus Christ or one of the great teachers or rabbis of the thinkers of the world, but I'm afraid it does undoubtedly, the world we live in today would be a very different place if it were not for the evil people as well, Just imagine if there had been no Adolf Hitler, no Joseph Stalin, the number of people that would be alive today who would be contributing to civilization, who would be able to have children and build businesses and do good things. And as a result, instead, millions upon millions of them were killed by these monsters. So as I say, I don't think it says very much about human nature that's good, but the evil people have to be restrained as much as the good people have to be allowed to do their work.
Well, on that fantastic question, I think we can conclude. thank you all for being with us. Thank you, Andrew, so much for spending time with us today. It's been fascinating, and I think everybody needs to go out quickly and buy The Chief, and soon take on Andrew and General Petraeus' new book. So thank you for being with us. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Reading.
Thank you.